Now, today's guest is Dr. Tia Moin, who is a chartered coaching psychologist and recently completed a PhD at the University of Reading. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more today. Tia also worked with us it's probably 2 years ago now, and you may have been on the Coaching Conversations when Tia launched the partnership work that she was doing with us at the Coaching Academy around sort of researching how coaching actually works. And I know lots of qualified coaches participated in that study, and that very study is linked into Tia's PhD research, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. Tia, welcome. Or should I say Dr. Tia, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Still feels weird hearing that, but thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, congratulations and well deserved. I know we've spoken over the years and the months, and I know that you've got a lot of hard work, but well deserved on your completed research and your published research. But I want to say welcome back to Coaching Conversations, because it doesn't seem that long ago that we were talking about the partnership research that we were looking to do together. So it's a real pleasure to have you back with us. So let's start first of all with maybe that research and then move into the heart of your work and what sparked your curiosity for the power of listening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon. And yes, so to acknowledge, first of all, huge thank you to anyone who did participate in that research a couple of years ago. I reached out to Sharon, and obviously the Coaching Academy has a huge network of coaches who are learning how to coach and practicing coaching. And what really sparked my curiosity for my PhD was I guess one of the key questions I was interested in understanding is, how does coaching work? And that really then, I guess, inspired a series of questions that led me onto the path of examining listening, because as we know, as coaches, listening is a large part of what we do in the coaching room. And you'll recall, Sharon, in that study we were looking at things that the coach does, and then how that then impacts the coachee, and then what kind of role that might be playing in coaching outcomes and what we see happening in the coaching room. So really, I guess, what sparked from those initial inquiries and the study and research that we did with the Coaching Academy was looking at specific sort of coach behaviours. One of the ones that I really honed in on for my PhD was listening. And then I've got some answers. I feel like I've got some answers in that. How does coaching work? Obviously, we can't answer that question completely just off the back of a couple of research studies, and there's always limitations to research, but certainly got some more theories and understanding, which I'm going to be sharing with you today.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. And I think, and I'm no doubt you'll sort of dive into how your research distinguished everyday listening from high quality listening in the coaching context. Before we sort of dive into that, I know, certainly for those of us that are coaches or considering becoming coaches, sometimes there's very much the focus on high quality questions as a key skill. But you chose to sort of move into that listening. You've highlighted listening itself. Could you just sort of unpack that a bit more for us, and how listening alone drives that meaningful change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things, isn't it, where it's so ubiquitous, listening, and because it seems like the listener isn't really doing anything, you're just kind of sitting there observing, or if you're watching a conversation, we tend to focus more on the speaker or what's being said. And that goes, I think, with any kind of conversation where you might be trying to influence someone to change, we always focus on what can we say, you know, how can I convince this person to think differently or to behave differently? And we really underestimate the role or the power that the person who's simply listening has in that conversation. And so from other research that around listening, we know, for example, that the listener doesn't play a passive role, that they do have an effect on how conversations will turn out, how the speaker feels, how openly the speaker engages. So I guess it's just based on that, you know, from having done a literature review, and I worked with some amazing researchers, my supervisors, who also had done a whole body of research already into listening. And so yeah, it was really, I guess, the obvious pathway to explore, you know, how does listening, and I think just overlooked as well. I don't see a lot of research in the coaching space that really has focused on listening and what, you know, what impact listening has in the coaching conversation.
No, I think you're spot on actually, because we talk a lot about, the core skill of awareness raising and, as I say, sort of curious questioning and that type of
Mm.
thing. So this is why I was really fascinated by your research and in the conversations that we have had together. I was so keen to sort of share your findings with the wider community, because it is so impactful.
Mm.
um, I know you've got a little bit of a presentation which best shares your findings, in your research and in the paper that you've had published. So, if I pass over to you, probably would be better if I let you sort of lead with your findings, and if it's okay, maybe I'll pop in with some questions if there's sort of areas that pique my interest that I'd like you to expand a bit more on. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And similarly, if anyone in the audience has any sort of questions, I'm more than happy for people to pop them in the chat and address any questions directly. Um, okay, so I think I've shared my screen. Can people see? Can you see the screen?
Yeah, it's great, Tia. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so um, I'm going to talk today about understanding the power of listening, and particularly in the context of, in several contexts that I explored in my study. But what I'll try to do is sort of translate the findings and the outcomes into the context of coaching, and explain a bit more about how listening might facilitate change when we're having those kinds of conversations in the coaching room. Okay, so some of the things that we're going to focus on today are exploring, first of all, what the interpersonal outcomes or processes might happen as a result of listening, but also the intrapersonal. So that means like what's going on the inside when someone is being listened to, or conversely, when someone is doing the listening. So what I'm going to talk about, first of all, and this was the first part of my PhD research, was really kind of looking at what's needed to prepare to be a good listening practitioner. So did focus on listening training and that whole process. So we'll talk a bit about that. We'll talk about what role listening might play in conversations about strengths. So one of the studies I did was really examining the effects of listening on both the speaker and the listener during character strengths, while they were talking about character strengths, which I know many of the coaches may or may not employ in their coaching conversations. And then finally, looking at how we can leverage listening as an intervention to promote more harmony and reduce discord. So how do we use listening in the context of discussing disagreements, or there might be holding opposing attitudes? And obviously that's something I think that is becoming more and more prevalent in today's society. We're really seeing this polarization of attitudes, and that was another key area that I explored in the research. So first things first, defining what high quality listening is. And I think, Sharon, as you mentioned before, We have everyday listening. It's something that we all do, but we know that as coaches, what we try and do is really become high quality listeners, and this is what we're applying in the coaching room. So high quality listening is quite different to your average or your everyday listening. And the definition that I've got up here is around, first of all, it's a really kind of conscious, intentional thing that we do. It's not something that just happens. It's really interesting when you consider that listening is something that we all kind of naturally learn to do. But although we spend a lot of time at school learning to read and write, we don't really spend time at school learning how to listen to people. And it's something that you either through experience or through professional focus have focused on developing, or you haven't. So it's quite interesting just to reflect on, okay, well, have I actually thought about how I listen? Have I tried to develop myself? So it's a conscious, intentional activity, but I've put here equally intuitive. So as we listen, and those of you who are sort of advancing in your coaching careers and becoming more accomplished at coaching, you'll start to notice that you're relying more on your intuition when you're listening to people. That kind of reading between the lines, or really capturing the essence of what someone's trying to say. And it's a wholehearted effort. So it's not something that I don't think high quality listening can occur when it's half-hearted. It really has to be kind of all in, all your focus, all your attention, and it has to come from a good place. There needs to be this positive intention, this genuine respect for the speaker. And it's a mutual communicative expression. So as I said before, it's often felt that because the listener is often silent, that they're playing a passive role, but they're not. They're actually being quite active, even just through demonstrating that they're listening. So that's the definition of listening, and it really does build on a definition that is in the listening literature. So Kluger and Ishrikov have, I guess, come up with this model of high quality listening, where it is about the intention. So what is it that you value? You value the person that you're listening to, you value what they have to say, and then that drives your attention. And it might be, and I invite all the coaches here and people in the audience to reflect on what their listening intention is. Are you listening to empathize, for example, or are you listening to solve a problem, or are you listening to figure out what your next coaching question might be, or what your challenge might be? So I think when you think about what you value, what your intention is, that drives then what you're paying attention to when you're listening. And then that drives your understanding of what you've listened to. And we'll see later on in the presentation, the more someone feels understood, then the more kind of intimacy and the more of the relationship develops between the listener and the speaker. So you'll start to see, I guess, that continuation of valuing and paying attention and understanding as it grows. But I do invite people. I think, as I said, it's the intentional aspect, and thinking about what it is that you're listening for can really drive the quality of the listening interaction.
I love that, Tia, actually, sort of thinking about intention. Because when we're doing maybe any sort of training or learning around listening, and if we listen to any of Covey's work and we just sort of think about, am I listening with the sort of intent to reply or with, understand, etc. But I like this model around this sort of, what it is that I value. What's my intention behind my listening? And I hadn't really thought about it that way. So it's a great model, actually. Really, really nice way of putting it.
Yeah. And I think during the coaching interaction, that can change depending on what you're trying to achieve in the coaching. So we know, for example, sometimes the client might need a bit more support, or, you can kind of read, can't you, how your client is in the moment. And sometimes they might need a bit more of a push. And so you might be, playing different roles as you're doing the coaching conversation. So I think it's worth thinking about how that plays out and how that feeds into this listening intention. Okay, so one of the studies that I did in my PhD, I looked at how people train to listen. And I came up with a bit of a theory a dialectical listening theory, it's called, where I identified three main tensions that people experience during listening training. Now, on the first level, as we're sort of first learning to listen, it's a bit like sort of having your training wheels on. You might be really focused on the behaviors, active listening behaviors. We all know the drill. It's like we should repeat back what we've heard. We should use silence. We should summarize, making eye contact. So when we look at all these kind of components of listening, these behavioral components, we can all do that. We can all practice those. But interestingly, we can always tell when someone is, even if they're doing all the right behaviors and they're ticking all the boxes, we can always tell when someone is genuinely listening or not listening. So I guess what I'm saying is that the first tension is, rather than just being about behavior, it is also about this way of being that Carl Rogers really talked about in all his literature about listening and therapeutic listening. And that way of being really goes back to that intention, and having a positive intention or coming from a place of care and concern for your listener is really what kind of shapes that way of being. So the first tension I would say is that pull, particularly as a novice listener, if you're just learning to listen, I guess it's kind of reminding you to always go back to that positive intention, that way of being, and really thinking about why you want to listen and what kind of listener you want to be. And I believe that if you focus on that way of being, then the behaviors are going to automatically follow. Obviously, there are some contexts where, for example, it might be that people with autism might need to sort of, that might not come naturally if there are certain things like that going on. But otherwise, generally, and there needs to be more research in this, really, I think. But I think by focusing on your way of being, balancing that focus between behaviour and way of being is the first important one. The second tension that's experienced is when we get to that more advanced level of listening. And what you will see is that we start to rely on our intuition. So I could be saying something to you and I could be saying, yeah, everything's great, life's great, it's all fine and dandy. But somehow that that's not the full story. I'm not giving you the full picture. There's something going on under the surface. And that's where, as an advanced listener, you might be sort of relying on your intuition. You're kind of reading between the lines a little bit. And what I found in my research is that actually there might be clues, for example, that inconsistency between body language and what I'm saying, or it might be a metaphor or some kind of word that I keep repeating, and after a while you realize that I might be meaning something different every time I say that word. So there are things like that, little nuances that you pick up when you become a more experienced listener. And actually there might be, I guess, consistent patterns in the way that people communicate, but we're relying on our cultural knowledge, our cultural experience, our communication experience over years and years to pick up on those signals and interpret those signals. So that's this kind of second tension is, can we sort of be clinical about those and sort of say, well, yep, there are consistent patterns, if somebody's using metaphors a lot, or if somebody's verbal and body language is inconsistent, then this is what it means. But to be honest, there isn't enough research in that at the moment. I know communication research has only just started to look at what we call sort of multimodal communication, which is where we're looking at verbal cues and physical cues at the same time. But I think it's important to note that there is this kind of level of intuition that we often rely on. So there's this kind of dual system approach going on. And then the third tension is that, so we all know when we're listening to training to listen as coaches, that it's really important to hold the unconditional positive regard. And that comes from Carl Rogers' work on training to in therapeutic listening, because that space that we hold for our clients needs to be non-judgmental. We need to make our clients feel really safe, that they can be open. But what happens when your client's sharing something that you don't necessarily agree with? You know, they may hold a political view that you disagree with, or they may be doing something that is, you know, questions or challenges your moral values or ethics. And so there's this sort of balance we have to stride between being authentic and holding unconditional positive regard. And because we're all human beings, we're all going to have our own biases that, you know, we can't avoid that. This is a tension that I think is quite relevant for coaches, and that does come up quite often. So it's thinking about how we manage these tensions when we're learning to listen.
And again, a fascinating way of sort of breaking it down, because what sort of occurred to me when you were talking about those sort of three potential sort of areas of tension is how, if I am very clear, if I have clarity on what kind of listener I want to be, so my way of being, I'm wondering how much that potentially feeds into, okay, so can I really, you know, if I'm very clear and have clarity on the kind of listener I want to be, then does working with my client and holding that unconditional positive regard for them sort of make it easier, you know? So if I want to be an empathic, non-judgmental listener, does that support me in actually not having that tension around potentially maybe not sitting in unconditional positive regard? I don't know if that makes sense to you,
Yeah.
where I'm going with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, I think the intention is certainly, you know, drives your mindset, doesn't it? It drives that
Yeah,
way of being. And if you don't hold that positive intention, then it does become very difficult to listen. So I think it's important, but equally, as human beings, you know, we do have natural biases and barriers and experiences that we can't just kind of click our fingers and overcome. So I would say it depends, and I will talk a bit more about what we can do to try and manage those tensions now.
yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, so I did a systematic review on practitioner listening training, and I basically drew from over 200 sources of practitioner listening training, and found that these are some of the things that practitioner listening trainers are doing to address those tensions. And the first one is obviously, first of all, thinking about your way of being, deciding what kind of listener you want to be. But then it is important to practice the behaviours if we've not done them before. As I said before, you know, a lot of us haven't actually sat down and thought about how to listen. Maybe we interrupt people all the time. Maybe we jump in quickly with questions. And so it is just like any kind of learning to do any kind of activity. It's important to be self-aware and be aware of how you behave in those contexts so that you can fine tune. So I would say, you know, having the balance between one and two is important. And then with the holistic listening, what some of the things that we can do to try and prepare in terms of the holistic listening, apart from sort of developing our experience and becoming more experienced, is doing some what I call inner work. So to prepare to be a good listener, actually it's really helpful to sit down and think about what your barriers are, to listening. So you might have bad habits of, you know, jumping in or wanting to always have the answer or whatever it is. But equally, what are your biases? You know, who's the client that you're dreading coming in and sitting in front of you, that you think, oh my God, I wouldn't know how to coach them, I wouldn't know what to say if they started saying this or started bringing up a particular topic. And I think this is something I did, Sharon, as well. But when I was training to be a coach, I had a package of 60 coaching sessions. They were like 2 or 3 hours long, and I remember coming out of the other side and just feeling like I'd cleared all the skeletons out of the closet. No matter who came in front of me, I was sort of prepared to deal with it, because I talked about all of my fears and all of my biases and potential, how can I become the best listener that I can be. So this inner work became really important. And also just experiential learning, so being listened to yourself, and I'll talk a bit more about what kind of interpersonal effects happen when you're listened to, but having discussion-based learning as well, so talking about how to listen and what happened when that person did bring up that topic that you didn't agree with, having these conversations with your supervisor or with your coach, and having those conversations between peers as well when you're learning is so important.
I mean, I'm particularly drawn to number 4 because the inner work is often the bit that people are reluctant to do. In my experience, Tia, I've been a coach for 16 plus years, but it's often the inner work. And I'm talking about, sort of coaches as well as non coaches. The inner work is where the real work happens. That's where the real growth happens. But it can be a bit prickly, right? It can, when we're holding that mirror up to ourselves, if we're being truly honest about, our potential conscious and unconscious biases and barriers, it can be uncomfortable work, but that's really where the sweet spot and the growth lies. Certainly for me, anyway. And I don't think my inner work is ever going to be done. There's always more that we can do. We can go deeper and deeper and deeper, and we can grow more as a result, as a person and as a professional. But I don't know what your experience has been where that's concerned.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Sharon, and I think it really does. It's such a unique thing. We all have inner work to do, and some of us, I guess, deeper than others, depending on our experiences and what's happened to us over our the course of our lives. So I think it's difficult, and I think it's important to think about, the boundaries, and this might be something you discuss with your coaching supervisor, is okay, well, what are the boundaries then of what I work with or can work with, given the inner work I'm prepared to do, and just being aware of that. And I think that there is a conversation to be had and some self-exploration to be had when we're preparing to be good listeners. Okay, so I'll move on then. And I'm going to talk a bit about a subsequent study that I did, and this is now I'm going to move on and talk a bit more about the effects of listening. So what happens when we're listened to, and actually this kind of talks to as well why I think part of the inner work that we do as preparation might even be, for you to be listened to as the listener and to experience, coaching or therapy or supervision or whatever form that comes in. But essentially, one of the studies that I did, we looked at the difference between high quality listening and moderate quality listening while people talked about their character strengths. So there was complete strangers, and they were brought together just to talk about character strengths. And one group of people were given training in high quality listening just before the conversation, and the other group weren't, were given a sort of comparable training that didn't manipulate the listening skills. So first of all, what we found was that there was better quality listening in the high quality listening group. And what happened was that the high quality listening group, both the speaker and the listener experienced something called positivity resonance, and that wasn't as present in the moderate quality listening. So it wasn't predicted by listening in the moderate quality condition. So positivity resonance is, for anyone that wants to look it up, Barbara Fredrickson is the researcher, is a shared experience between two people where they will demonstrate mutual care and concern towards each other. There will be a biological kind of synchronicity, so it might be shared release of oxytocin, for example, and kind of biological It might be that your heart rate regulates between the two of you, that and so there's this biological synchronicity, and it's shared positive affect as well. So you're both kind of enjoying or feeling positive about the interaction. So that was present only in the high quality listening condition while both were talking about character strengths. So we could say with reasonable certainty that positivity resonance is linked then to high quality listening, and particularly I guess in a context where you think actually it could be the character strengths that creates that sense of positivity resonance. But what we found, we can say for sure, is that in this context it was the listening that created that effect. And then what we also found in my study was that the listening played a role in facilitating this intention to further apply character strengths after the conversation. And that was because it inspired feelings of authenticity. Now, what we found was that no matter which listening condition people were in, when they talked about character strengths, that inspired feelings of authenticity. But there was, I guess, the listening, the high quality listening, played a part in people wanting to continue to apply their strengths after the conversation. So I guess what we can take from that is, if for any coaches that talk about strengths or, and I think even if it's not specifically about character strengths, I think as coaches, we tend to point out people's strengths, don't we, and past achievements, that just the listening, perhaps being mindful of how you listen in those conversations, because it can support those feelings of authenticity as well, and then have that sort of effect on what they might want to do about their strengths afterwards.
It's a real gift, isn't it, to be able to have that positive or positivity resonance between the speaker and the listener, and that sort of synchronicity, I think I've pronounced that correctly, that happens almost magically when that it's like a giving and receiving of a gift, really, sort of like, raising the oxytocin levels and clicking in or connecting in with someone's, human being's deep
Mm.
desire to feel truly understood. So
Yes. Yeah.
did you find that this happens? This is slightly offshoot to
Mm.
your research, Tia, but I don't know whether it sort of took in this direction. But did you find that it also was a similar thing when people were talking about things other than their character strengths?
Yes, so we'll talk about that in a moment.
Right.
It wasn't a study that I did. I looked at intimacy, which I'll talk about in a moment. But within my lab, we did another study where people talked about disagreements, and the positivity resonance was still present as an effect from high quality listening. So I think, whether it's a constructive conversation or it's a conversation that is more contentious or anxiety provoking, when we do high quality listening, we can create this sense of positivity resonance between both the speaker and the listener.
And was there sort of like we sort of talk about in coaching that the coach needs to listen more than they speak. Does it still follow a percentage now, or has your research sort of pushed that to one side?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that,
Yeah.
Sharon. And I am doing more research where I'm looking at sort of the balance between listening and support in coaching. Sorry, listening, support, and challenge in
Yeah.
coaching. So I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't think we've researched it enough to say, but I think we can, if we understand, how listening works, and then further research, we understand how questioning and challenging works, then we can try and put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk about listening during disagreements. So as I said, I'm doing research at the moment as well, where we're trying to define listening across cultures, and I'm interviewing people on what they perceive listening to be. And some of the questions are talk about listening during disagreements, and it seems to be quite unanimous that people find it hard to listen to others when we disagree with what they're saying. You know, we might switch off because we're worried about it turning into an argument, or we might even discredit, you know, what they're saying. We might think, oh, they're naive, or you know, you hold less, you kind of put less value on what they're saying, and that kind of disintegrates that positive intention that we were talking about before. But it's a natural, I guess it's quite a natural thing that we find it harder to listen to people when we disagree. And in professional listening, we know that there is, for example, in the therapeutic field, there's a lot of research into something called countertransference, which is when the therapist feels triggered by what they've heard, and they might, you know, it might affect how they react or respond to the person that they're doing therapy with. So I guess this is something that hasn't really been discussed a lot in the coaching field, and I think perhaps it needs to be explored a bit more, because you know, our personal biases or experiences could lead to counter-transference, and you know, we may feel triggered by what we've heard. But I did some the one of the studies that we did was a large cross-cultural study. There were participants from over 86 countries in the study, and it was based around a high quality listening training that was fit for purpose. So it was all about training the listeners um, how to listen in the context of, you know, discussing opposing attitudes or disagreements, and the outcomes were that the training led to an increased sense of interactional intimacy between the speakers and the listeners. So people felt, I guess, a sense of closeness to the other person, even though they were talking about a contentious topic, and this was between strangers in a 15-minute interaction. And then that then facilitated self-insight. So people with that self-awareness that we were talking about, Sharon, earlier, and an openness towards changing one's attitudes. So I think the training itself also had a direct impact on self-insight. And then that self-insight facilitated that openness towards changing attitudes. But we also know from previous listening research that's been done under kind of lab conditions, that high quality listening can help people to increase their attitude clarity, feel, I guess, more comfortable with ambiguity in their attitudes, and also support attitude change, and do things like reduce prejudiced attitudes. So I think there is, you know, quite a, I guess, potential to look at listening and listening training when we want to try and create more positive relationships, particularly in contexts where there are differing views and opposing attitudes and opinions, and where we want to increase the quality of relationships. Okay, so from, I guess, sort of coming to the end of wrapping up all the insights that I got from my PhD, and relating it back to the big question, Sharon, like, how does coaching work? I feel like I got some of the answers that I wanted, and essentially I came up with a bit of a theory, in that, at least in part, what I think is happening in the coaching room. And obviously I just want to sort of highlight that this is kind of me extrapolating theory from the findings that I found in my PhD. But what I feel like is happening is that through that listening and that safe space that we create, through high quality listening in particular, we create a positive relational experience. And as human beings, we're social beings. We're hardwired to want to relate to people. That's part of self-determination theory. You know, it's one of it's a basic human need that we need to feel connected to people. We fear social rejection. And I think what happens is when we listen, we create that safe space so that people can then go and authentically explore who they are. So it's an autonomy supportive behavior, where I can then feel free to really explore what my true attitudes are and who I am, and express those openly without any fear of being rejected or any fear of that sort of coming back to me. And that feeling authentic, you know, as you said, Sharon, I think it's like, I don't think anyone would argue that we all strive to feel understood and accepted by others, and that feeling of authenticity can really build our self-esteem. And that, I think, you know, can come about as a direct result of listening, but also from that positive relational experience of being listened to. And then what can also then arise as a result of that is something called self-integration. And this is sort of, if we go into self-determination theory, that our internal and our external selves can align more, so we can, you know, that intrinsic motivation that we really try and get at as coaches, you know, that process can be facilitated through listening because of the positive relational experience, because of the authenticity that we're supporting and facilitating. And then, so that's, you know, part of, for anyone who's interested in the theories, I've put them down on the left hand side there. You've got the positivity resonance, which builds on Barbara Fredrickson's earlier theory, which is broaden and build theory, which is all about positive emotions, and that when we experience positive emotions, we tend to sort of open up our thinking. We're more open to building more ideas, building new relationships. Episodic listening theory is a theory that supports that if I'm being more authentic as a speaker, then you'll encourage then the person you're speaking to be more authentic as well, because you're almost creating that safety to kind of share with each other. And you know, as I disclose, you'll disclose more. That then builds the relationship even more. So that's why I've kind of put it as this upward spiral, because the more we share, the more we disclose, and the more we get that reinforcement, then the more likely we're going to do it, and the more we build our self-esteem, and the more we self-integrate. So there's this almost like this swirl of positive upward spiral that happens through listening, through all of these various functions that occur.
Fantastic. It's just, you know, just the whole thing. I mean, I'm a bit of a theory geek, so I'm definitely
Yes.
going to be looking up some of these theories later.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Absolutely. And then how do we integrate all this listening research into your practice? I think that's probably the key question that
yeah,
people are interested in. And I think, you know, it's funny because when I was putting these bullet points together, I was also thinking about the potential to abuse it. But I think because of that positive, and because we can't do high quality listening without a positive intention, I think it would be really hard to abuse this kind of thing. So I kind of feel reassured that it's such a core component, the positive intention of the model, that you know, it can only be used for good, I hope. But what I would say is, you know, as a coaching practitioner, the way I will apply the research into my practice is that in the first session, particularly, I think it's really important to just focus on establishing your relationship. You know, we know there's so much coaching research on how important the relationship is for coaching to be effective. And so if we can just really, you know, worry about all your questions and your models and things like that later, but in the first instance, you know, focus on establishing the relationship, and, you know, just fall back on your core skills. I remember one of my supervisors when I was first training, and I was getting all caught up in all these different models, and she said, Tia, just listen, just focus on listening. And I did, and it was just so powerful. And I think that is what I would recommend if you're sort of a new coach and you're struggling with all of this stuff. Fall back on your listening skills, the core skills. I would also suggest that we maybe flex the listening muscle when you've experienced a critical moment in the coaching. So Eric DeHaan, he's a coaching psychology researcher. He talks about these critical moments that can happen during coaching where potentially relationship is disrupted or broken. So if you need to repair and maintain the coaching relationship as you're talking about difficult topics, maybe that's when you can fall back on listening. When someone's really feeling conflicted about who they are, they're unclear about their thoughts, we know that listening helps give people that clarity, that self-awareness, that feeling of authenticity, feeling validated. So that's when you can kind of consciously bring it into your practice. And lastly, I think the strengths, although my study supported that, I think there's more research to really confirm it and unpack that more. But I don't think it's going to hurt if we start to think about how we listen during conversations about strengths, because if it does inspire someone to apply and integrate the character strengths, then I think that's something easy that we can incorporate into our listening practice. So that concludes my presentation. I guess I open up the floor if anyone's got any questions or anything that you would like to comment on.
Oh, there's some great things in the chat box. We're just sort of coming up to sort of the end of our time, so I know some people will need to be sort of leaving us. But if anyone has any specific questions that they wanted to follow up on, where can people find out a little bit more about you and connect with you, Tia?
Yeah, so you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search up Tia Moin on LinkedIn, or the inclusioncoach.co.uk. All my contact details are on there as well. So you're very welcome to reach out to me. I'm really happy to have conversations about coaching and listening with anyone.
And you're always so gracious with your time as well, Tia. So I really appreciate that. Um, Let's just pop into the comments box before we sign off. What is it that you're taking away from today, from the conversation that you've had and you've listened to Tia? What one thing are you going to take away and just sort of help yourself in your growth and development to be a high quality listener? And you've heard some ideas from Tia. Tia, before we finish up, what is it that's lighting you up at the moment? What's next in your work?
What I'm very interested in at the moment is looking at comparing sort of human listening with AI listening, because I know
Ah,
that's something that is a big conversation in the coaching world. So that's lighting up my ideas at the moment. Yeah.
fascinating. Well, if and when you finish that research, I'd love for you to come back and share. AI is an area I've been particularly interested in how it can support coaching positively as long as it's used as a tool and not the other way around. So yeah, I'd love
Absolutely.
to have you back to talk more about that. Sarah, I wish we had more time because I feel like we're just scratched the surface on all
Absolutely.
of these things. What would be the one thing that you would hope people who are coaches or are interested in developing their listening to have taken away from your sharing today?
I think it's probably that inner work piece. That's the bit I feel we gloss over, don't we? We do the listening training, but we don't necessarily always do the inner work. And I feel like, if anything, that's the golden nugget that I think will help unlock your listening ability.
I would agree with that 100%. Thank you again, Tia. Appreciate it so much, and the work that you
Well,
did in partnership with us a couple of years ago that has fed into this research. And congratulations again on your doctorate and the publication as a result. And thank you, everyone, for listening today into Coaching Conversations. And I look forward to you joining us all next time during International Coaching Week, where we will get together for 4 times across that week rather than the usual one. But from me, Catherine, Tia, and from the whole of the Coaching Conversations team and Coaching Academy team, take care and bye for now. Thank you.